Dan was dead tired. As he started to climb the stairs, he couldn't believe it was only a little after 10. But his most pressing thought was not of sleep. With every step, he felt his energy surge. He had a card on the sculptor and a leather folder to go through. The closer he got to his room, the more wired he felt. Dan was relieved to find that Felix was still gone. He wanted to look at the stuff he'd taken in private. He pulled out the index card and the folder and put them on his desk. His fingers were repelled by them. The stench of the basement and his itch made him feel unclean, but he couldn't stop. He took a look at the index card first. Hemline, Dennis, alias the sculptor. Born 1935. DOA 5/15/1965. Reason for admittance: serial killer. Homicidal: why? Recovered: why? Why? Dan was shocked by the last line. A serial killer. Recovered? How? How would you even know? Then something else caught his eye. On the bottom right corner of the card, 3 handwritten numbers. 361. Suddenly, Dan was clawing at his shoulders, trying to stop the itch. The card sat on the desk, just as it was, but the 361 seemed to shimmer. Get a grip, Dan. He really had to calm down. Take a shower. But first he took the card and the folder and hid them in the drawer with the warden. Dan stood in the shower for a long time. Jung had this way of talking about consistencies, one that Dan had always liked. Basically, he said that when people saw a meaningful connection between two moments, a coincidence, the connection wasn't because one moment led to the other. It was because people's brains were always making connections. The sculptor was patient 361. His discovery couldn't be a coincidence. It was a connection. Dan fumbled with the towel and his clothes in his haste to get back to his room. He grabbed the folder and flipped through the sheets of paper inside. Invoices, employee evaluations. Dan gave everything a passing glance, but he didn't stop on anything until he came to a slip of folded paper. The sheet was torn, as if it had been yanked out of a journal or a notebook. Dense cursive handwriting filled the page. He sat on his bed and began to read. Very nature of his ailment continues to baffle me, and baffle us all. What is the source of this abnormality? Everywhere we observe plants, animals, systems with a core. Every flower has its seed. Every animal has its heart. Every masterpiece its inspiration. Yet the answer I seek eludes me. There is a root somewhere in his brain, a twisted root that sprouts madness and malice. I will find it, no matter the cost, no matter the difficulty. I will find it. I will live a truly great life. My colleagues will no doubt hang me metaphorically, but I say let them hang. Legality, morality, sympathy aside, I will pull madness out by its black root, and I will leave a legacy no man, however sanctimonious, can fault. A truly great life, that is what humanity deserves. Not an average life, not even a normal one. A life in which genius is not an anomaly, but an expectation. But to achieve such things. And there the page ends. Dan flipped it over, perfectly aware that it was blank on the other side, but wanting to know more, much more. Without context, without a signature, this piece of paper wasn't much to go on. The writer of this page was clearly talking about curing someone who was insane, and he was talking about something unusual, some new treatment that he alone might discover. Dan's mind began to race. These weren't the musings of some random Brookline doctor. These had to be the ideas of its warden. And not just any warden. If he was to believe the conspiracy enthusiast Sal Weathers, the warden, the one who had changed Brookline's history and rehabilitated a serial killer. Reading the journal page, Dan admired the warden's great vision. This man was willing to try something revolutionary to cure insanity. He dared to be different, to challenge the status quo, even if he was rejected for it. Wasn't that a little of what Dan was like? Scorning the popular opinion, the popular crowd, and aspiring to something more? But this note wasn't just promoting intelligence, he thought. This was something a little more sinister. Genius is an expectation. Genius was nice and all, but you couldn't force it on people. Could you? Besides, what kind of treatment could do something like that? What could put a Y next to recovered? He leaned back on his pillow, trying to put the pieces together in his head. The horrible photograph of the patient struggling, this piece of paper by the warden about a madman, the emails about patient 361, the sculptor. It all seemed to be adding up. But to what? Dan grabbed his laptop. When he went back to Sal Weathers' website and clicked Contact Me, he was totally just looking for an email address. But good old Sal had listed his full details, and Dan was shocked to find an address that wasn't just in New Hampshire. It was in Camford. One of Professor Reyes's petitioners, I'll bet, Dan murmured. It now made sense that Sal Weathers would be so invested in cataloging and publishing Brookline's sordid history. He was probably hoping to get the place tore down. Part of him wished Sal lived across the county, or in Cambodia, so that the temptation to visit him wouldn't be so strong. But all signs were pointing to a meeting with this man, and Dan wasn't about to ignore a message from the universe. So it's official, he whispered to the computer. I'm obsessed. He stood in a cell, waiting. Finally, a group of doctors came in, all wearing masks and gowns. Dan waited for them to hurt him, but they didn't seem to know that he was there. They stood around, talking and jotting notes on their pads. Then Dan heard screaming. 2 orderlies came into the room, dragging a girl between them. She was barely 10 years old, and her face was familiar. Pale, frightened, with big open eyes. Okay, fellows, let's get to work on her. At the sound of his own voice, Dan bolted awake. Even in his sleep, he couldn't escape. Usually Abby beat him to the dinner hall, but despite the late night and broken sleep, Dan saw no sight of her or Jordan as he got in line for breakfast. He heaped hash browns, eggs, and a few strips of bacon onto his plate and grabbed a bowl of cereal from the end of the buffet before heading to their usual spot, a circular table by the far windows. While he finished eating his eggs and bacon, he watched the other students filing in, but Abby and Jordan still didn't come. He started in on his cereal, taking his time with it. As the minutes ticked by with no sign of his friends, he became increasingly aware of the fact that he was the only student eating alone. He was used to this at his high school, but here he felt conspicuous, naked without his friends. Finally, he spotted Jordan, who looked even worse than Dan felt, if that was possible. "Hey," Jordan said, sitting down with a hump. Big nasty bags rimmed his eyes behind his glasses. "You all right? Looking a bit tired there." "I'm fine," Jordan snapped, sounding decidedly unfine. Dan glanced at the door again. Abby would know how to make this better. "She'll show up when she shows up," Jordan said. "Can't you even wait a second to see her?" He bit into his English muffin as if it had personally insulted him. "What the hell? Are you okay, Jordan?" Dan risked, knowing Jordan might go for him again. "I'm fine, Jesus. What is this? The Inquisition? Are you on my dad's payroll now?" The English muffin was dying a painful death in Jordan's tightening grip. A piece broke off and landed in his bowl of Cap'n Crunch. Jordan fished it out with his chewed-up fingernails. They fell into an uneasy game of looking anywhere but at each other. Given his options, get chewed out again or stare at his cereal, Dan chose the cereal. Could Jordan still be angry about last night? With 5 minutes until the dining hall closed, Abby finally made an appearance. She dashed to the fruit and granola line and grabbed a banana and a bowl of yogurt. Her usual shiny disposition was gone. Her eyes were half-lidded, and her pretty olive complexion was ashen. She sat down with a quick, "Hey," and started eating without another word. "Hey," Jordan said, "did you come down with anything? You look terrible." "What are you talking about?" Abby glared. "Nothing. I was just saying you looked radiant." "New makeup?" "Yeah, because sarcasm is exactly what I need right now." Dan tried to lighten the mood. "Well, sounds like somebody woke up on the wrong side of the gurney." He immediately wished he had kept his mouth shut. Abby looked at him, her eyes flashing in anger. She dropped her spoon in her bowl, splattering yogurt all over her tray. "Actually, Dan, there was something important I wanted to talk to you guys about, but I guess it will have to wait." With that, she grabbed her tray and left the table. "Congratulations," said Jordan. "That might be the briefest relationship in the history of the universe." Jordan finished his mangled muffin. "In fact, since you're not even technically a couple yet, it's sure to be one of those delightful death by silent treatment endings. Quel dommage. What the hell did I do to piss you guys off?" But Jordan was already on his way out, and Dan ended up saying it to the back of his head. Dan's mood worsened in class when the professor showed a documentary he had already seen, which meant he sat for 2 hours in the dark, distracted, not a word of the film penetrating his brain while he replayed the breakfast in his head. Maybe it wasn't fair to expect Abby to be sunshine and daisies all the time. Everyone was allowed to have a bad day here and there. She might have gotten another disheartening text from her sister. Whatever the cause, Dan decided it was foolish to read too much into it. Abby would tell him what was wrong in her own time, and he could be there to listen when she did. He wouldn't let a bad breakfast spoil things between them. With that reasonable plan in mind, Dan felt his spirits lift on the walk back to Brookline. Neither Jordan nor Abby had said anything about lunch, so he figured he would try to fit in a bit of studying, or he thought. His nerves coming to jittery life, he could make good on his self-promise to visit Sal Weathers. He'd have more than enough time if he hurried. Felix was in when Dan got back to his room. He was, as always, at his computer. It looked like he was browsing a bodybuilding forum, of all things, and Dan noticed that his roommate was sucking down something called Muscle Aid, which, judging by the strapping oil dude on the bottle, was some kind of pre-packaged protein shake. Not Felix's usual diet. But then again, Dan had known the kid for a grand total of a week. Still, he thought Felix looked more buff than he had when he first arrived. His shoulders seemed broader somehow. Maybe protein shakes worked after all. "Hey," Dan said, going straight to his own desk. "Hello, Dan." Finishing his drink, Felix crushed the plastic bottle in his hand and threw it over his shoulder, and Dan watched amazed as it landed squarely in the garbage can behind him. "Nice throw," Dan said, trying to cover his surprise. A crisp white envelope waiting on Dan's keyboard. His heart beat a little faster. Was it from Abby? An apology? Or maybe an invitation to go somewhere and talk? "Did you see who brought this?" Dan asked, opening the envelope. "No, it was there when I came in. I assumed you put it there before you went to breakfast." "Shit. I must have forgotten to lock the door this morning," Dan said. It was a hard habit to get into. Still, he could swear he'd locked things up that morning. "That's troubling," Felix replied, not taking his eyes from his computer screen. "Please don't let that happen again." "Sorry, man, I won't." Inside the envelope, Dan found a simple card made of thick paper. On it was just a single line of spidery handwriting. A single question. "How do you kill a hydra?" That was distressing. Dan flipped the card over. "You strike at its heart." What kind of sick joke was this? Dan looked at Felix, who hadn't turned around or moved a muscle. "Are you sure you didn't see who left this?" Dan said. "I'm sure. It's not signed?" "No, it's not signed." Dan flashed the card at Felix, but not long enough for him to be able to read it. Strange. Do you recognize the handwriting?" Felix continued browsing his current web page, the wheel on his mouse clicking softly as he spun it. "No, it's calligraphy. Or something. Nobody writes like this anymore." "Calligraphers do." "Do you know any calligraphers?" Dan snapped. At last, Felix turned around. He thought for a few seconds and then said calmly, "Not at this program, no. I do have a friend back at school, though, who's pretty good at it." "That doesn't help me." Sighing, Dan dropped into his chair and swirled it around. "Sorry. Bad day. I understand. And I hope you find your mystery pen pal. Sinking deeper into his chair, Dan flipped the card over and over again, studying the handwriting, trying to find some clue in the words. Hydra. There were at least 50 kids in Professor Douglas's class who would have heard the clever nickname he had given the three of them yesterday. Dan had no way of pinning down the identity of the writer. What if Joe, the hall monitor who had caught them in the old wing, had placed the card on his desk? It actually made a weird kind of sense. Joe would want to keep them from snooping around again after hours, and the note was just creepy and threatening enough to make Dan think twice about a repeat of last night. Joe would also, as a hall monitor, have a master key to the rooms, which fit because Dan was positive he had locked the door that morning. The knot in Dan's stomach loosened. Thinking of Joe as the author of the note made the whole thing feel inexplicable at the very least, and perhaps even a little bit funny. Haha, Joe, you got me good. But Dan wasn't entirely convinced. He decided he'd bring the card to dinner. If Jordan and Navi had received notes too, they may be able to figure out together. Until then, Dan knew he definitely wouldn't be able to do any real studying. And if anything, the card only strengthened his determination to meet Sal Weathers. There wasn't enough time left in lunch break to make it to town and back, so he decided to skip his next class. He threw his sweatshirt on again, pulling up Sal's address on his phone, grabbed his backpack, then sped out the door. It felt good to get out of the dorm. Things had a way of feeling so heavy there. The weather seemed to be on his wavelength, overcast and chilly despite the fact that it was June. It looked like it might rain. Dan walked briskly, keeping his head down and following the path that led from the dorms back to the academic side and beyond. The paved path dipped, taking a wide curve down a hill. For all the hustle and bustle on campus, Kempford always felt rather small and quiet. Today the streets were particularly empty. A lone pickup truck sped by as Dan made it down to the bottom of the hill. 3 blocks, 1 donut shop, and a car garage later, Dan was at his destination. He snuggled down deep into his sweatshirt, staring up the drive to a brick dormered house set back from the road. Pausing, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning above the tree line. From here, he could just make out the top of the old church steeple, and beyond that, Wilford Commons and Brookline's roof. He fished out a notebook and pen from his backpack, wondering how best to introduce himself. A simple wicker cross hung in the window of the front door. Dan knocked, suddenly hoarse with nerves, already thinking it had been a mistake to come. Sure, Sal sounded talkative on his website, but would he be so effusive in person? Dan would have to express his own interest in a way that would get him the information he needed. He knocked again with more conviction. Finally, he heard a shuffling from the inside. A spotted, craggy face appeared in the window behind the cross, and a second later the door flew open. The scent of cinnamon candles rushed out to meet him. "What are you selling?" "Selling? Oh, no, nothing. I'm from the college," Dan explained. He gestured clumsily over his shoulder to the hill. I was going to email you, but I'm sorry. I know this is sort of strange, but I found your web page. The one about Brookline? I'm doing a project on it, and you seem like the local expert, so... Sal stared at him, clearly trying to decide if he was crazy or joking or both. "Come in," he finally muttered, disappearing into the dark mudroom. A light came on, showing a shoe rack filled almost exclusively with work boots and ladies' slippers. "So you found my little report on the internet, huh? Good. That's good. More people ought to know. But I gotta tell you, kid, I don't much like talking about it. None of us do. I said my piece with that page on the internet, and now the only time I want to talk about it is to get that hell of a place torn down. Of course, some bitch up at the college won't stand for it, says it's historical." "I think you mean Professor Reyes," Dan said pointedly. "She's actually planning to run a seminar in the dorm, and then—" "A dorm? So they're housing you kids in it now, are they? That's a real laugh." Sal shuffled into the kitchen, and Dan followed. He had a feeling he would be leaving with a blank notebook. "This is my wife," Sal was saying. "Don't mind us, honey. This young man's from the college, but he's not staying very long." The kitchen was cramped, furnished with cheap laminate cabinets and Malvais tiles. Dan ducked his head shyly. "Hello," he greeted Sal's wife. She was gaunt, sunken, but Dan saw shadows of a pretty woman gone old and frail. Her thick hair was tied into a bun at her nape, and a heavy fringe of bangs covered her forehead. She seemed to be staring at nothing, her hands propped slightly on the island countertop in the middle of the room. Sal puttered around the island until he found a coffee mug. He checked its contents and then took a big sip. When he glanced back up and saw Dan still standing there, a look of resignation crossed his face. He shuffled over until he was almost right in Dan's face and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "All right, kid. You get one question. What did you want to know so bad?" Dan hardly knew where to start. He tried to collect his thoughts into one single question. Finally, hoping this one question would lead to so many answers, he said, "I just wanted to know more about Dennis Hemline." Instantly, he knew he'd said something wrong. Sal flinched, and behind him, his wife stopped staring at whatever was so interesting over Dan's shoulder and looked right at his eyes. Dan blundered on, Well, I was curious about the connection between the last warden and Dennis Hemline, the sculptor." "What did you say your name was?" Sal interrupted, slamming his mug down on the island. "I didn't," Dan stammered, taking a step back. It's Dan. Dan Crawford." It was like a bomb had gone off. Suddenly Sal's wife was screaming, throwing herself down on the island countertop, swinging her arms and sending Sal's mug and a stack of dishes crashing to the floor. Dan leapt back, only to have Sal descend on him, his craggy old face red with blotches. "What the hell kind of sick joke are you trying to pull? My wife is ill and you come in here like that? You damn college kids, always so smart. So clever, eh? Not so clever today. Get out! Get out!" Dan hardly bothered to turn, backing out as fast as he could without getting tangled up in the shoe rack and the door. The woman shrieking followed him onto the stoop. Then Sal was at the door, still shouting, "Get the hell out of here!" As if Dan wasn't trying to do exactly that. He ran. He ran until he reached the hill and the path winding back up to the college. What had just happened? What had he said? How could Dennis Hemline be such a sore subject when Sal himself had written about the guy? When Dan reached his room, Felix was gone. A note on his dry erase board read simply, "Departed for gymnasium, 1600. Dan rolled his eyes, thinking, just another Felix quirk. He shrugged off his backpack and flung himself down on his bed, miserable. He rolled on his back and shoved the pillow over his face. Class skipped, and for what? He was no closer to figuring out the link between the warden, the sculptor, Brookline, and himself than he had been at the start of the day. And now he had the horrific face of Sal's wife to add to the list of things haunting him, and her screams. Dan groaned into the pillow. He had to let it go, or he'd drive himself crazy over nothing. Sal was just a nutty old bat who hated the college and everything associated with Brookline. He probably grew up in Camford, resenting the kids who could afford a higher education. Wasn't there even a label for that? The townies and the gownies? It wasn't his fault. Outside, it had started raining. That would make getting to dinner a little less pleasant. But after the afternoon he'd just had, Dan was eager for friendly company. And it was already 5 minutes till 5, so there'd soon be people in the dining hall. He snatched up the Hydra note and headed downstairs. As he passed the hallway leading down to the old wing, he felt a sudden temptation to go there and hide. But he pressed on to the main doors, shaking off the fear that was creeping down his back. Dan pulled up the hood of his sweatshirt and ran through the downpour to the commons. He shook himself off when he reached the entrance, then followed the line of students forming inside the cafeteria. Mac and cheese night. Could be worse. Dan grabbed a tray, his eyes roaming over half-familiar faces as he looked for his friends. Saw Yi come in and wave to a few guys on the other side of the room before getting in line right behind him. "How's it going?" Yi asked, drumming his fingers on his pastel blue tray. "You know, the usual. Studying, classes, threatening notes, psychos. Yourself?" "So amazing." Yi pulled a slip of paper out of his cargo pants and handed it to Dan. "Oh God, did Yi get a strange note too?" But when he unfolded it, Dan saw it was only a printed out dating profile for someone with a screen name, Cello 13. She liked skiing in Amelie. "I'm studying abroad on a scholarship in the fall. Conservatory in Paris." Dan handed the paper back to Yi, smiling dreamily down at it. "Just a few more months and I'll be swimming in hot foreign women." Dan coughed. "Yeah, I could have phrased that better." Yi put Cello 13 back in his pocket. The line moved forward. "How's things in the Abbey front?" They settled up to the buffet. Dan slopped macaroni onto his warm plate. "How did you—" Jordan mentioned a date or something. "How'd it go?" Surprisingly, Yi bypassed the mac and cheese and went for the vegan offering. Something with lentils and unidentifiable chunks of vegetable matter. "Things with Abby are good," Dan managed to croak. Honestly, he didn't know what to think, considering how Abby had been this morning. "And I guess it was a date. We just got dinner at Brewster's. Hung out. It was a nice time." Dan dug a big metal ladle into the macaroni again, preparing to take another serving. "Bullshit. You get any?" Dan dropped the spoon, and it clattered against the edge of the buffet. He caught it, but not before splattering himself with globs of cheese product. "Crap, that's hot!" He half-elbowed, half-bumped the spoon back into the tray and tried to brush the neon orange cheese off of his forearm. Yi chuckled, moving away from the line. "I'll take that as a no." Swearing, Dan grabbed a dinner roll from the pile and then walked over to their usual table. He dropped into the chair nearest to the window, brooding over his steaming plate of food. His time with Abby last night felt private, not something to be discussed casually over the dinner line. Or maybe it was just that he didn't know how things stood, and he didn't want to jinx them by bragging. He rubbed at the splotchy red marks on his skin. They were still smarting. "Hey!" It was Abby. Her hair was in a damp tangle, and her eyes were red. She set her tray on the table and sat down slowly, as if moving through water. "Hey," Dan said, forgetting his burn. "Can I sit? I mean, I'm sitting already, but..." She looked down into her soup, sighing. "Do you mind?" "No, by all means," Dan said. "I was hoping you'd turn up." "Yeah?" Smiling, Abby put her elbows onto the table. "Thanks. I was pretty horrible at breakfast. But I have a good excuse. I promise. I wouldn't just be like that." "It's okay if you were," he replied. "We all have rotten days." He nodded to the window behind them, where rain fell in noisy sheets against the glass. "See, the weather's feeling like crap too." "No, I like the rain. It's relaxing, refreshing." She gazed out the window. Puddles were forming in the lower dips of the grass and along the pathways, and the mist was swirling so that the rain and fog couldn't be teased apart. "I needed a bit of rain." Dan smiled. Already she was making him feel better. He decided he'd wait for Jordan to get there before mentioning the note. So he and Abby more or less ate in comfortable silence until Jordan stumbled into the dining hall. After a quick breeze through the food line, he sat down with just a cup of piping hot coffee and a slice of Boston cream pie. He didn't even say hello. Rain and the steam from the coffee fogged his glasses, but Dan couldn't wait any longer. "I got a note," he blurted, startling Abby and Jordan. He reached into his backpack and took out the card, dropping it onto the table between them. Jordan picked it up. "How do you kill a hydra? What the hell?" "Turn it over." Jordan read the back, his face a mixture of confusion and distaste. "What is this? Where did it come from?" Jordan pushed the card away with a grimace, and Abby grabbed it. "It was on my desk when I got back from class. Felix didn't see who left it, but someone managed to get into the room, even though I'm sure I locked the door. You guys didn't get anything like this?" They both shook their heads. Dan was dismayed. He hadn't realized how much he was counting on this being a bad joke. Rubbing his temples, he said, "I think it could be from Joe. I don't know who else would leave something like this, or even be able to get into the room. But I was sure he'd have left them for you guys, too." Dan pushed the macaroni into a little hill. "I don't like feeling singled out." "So what are you going to do?" Abby asked, giving the card back to him. Dan shrugged. He knew it would be impossible to explain to anyone else why this bothered him so much. He wasn't even sure he fully understood it himself. "Just ignore it," Jordan said. "Joe's trying to rile you up, that's all. That's what bullies do. Trust me, I know. It's better if you let it slide off your back." They were silent for a moment. Then Abby said, "There's something else. Your note? It's important and all, but I wanted to tell you both something, too. It's what I was going to bring up at breakfast, before I got so, well, mad." She paused. "I'm not quite sure how to say this," she said, twisting her hands around each other. "So I'll just go for simple. Simple is probably best. If anything about this is simple..." As she talked, Dan noticed that her entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders sagged, and the light went out of her eyes. She took a deep breath. My aunt, my father's sister. She was a patient here. There was silence. Dan and Jordan looked at each other. How do you know? Asked Dan. Here, look what I found last night. Abby pulled an index card out from her raincoat. It was from the card catalog in the warden's office, and looked just like the one for Dennis Hemline. So Abby had taken something too. Hands shaking, Abby turned the card around so both Jordan and Dan could read it. There were just 4 lines typed. Valdez, Lucy, Abigail. Born 7/15/1960. DOA 2/12/1968. Recovered N.